Hello and welcome to another White Dwarf walkthrough. It's a little bit cold in the war room today, so I'm going to keep my hoodie on. As you can see, we've had a bit of a rearrange with the furniture out here. But welcome to White Dwarf 158. It's been asked by a few people to look at some of the older issues of White Dwarf, and this is one that actually predates my White Dwarf collecting, but I was fortunate enough to inherit an excellent collection of pre-issue 200 White Dwarfs from my friend Treefrog. And if you want, you can check out his channel over on YouTube. If you like people making things with their hands, cutting things out of wood, wandering off to get cups of tea, losing their tools and going on random divergences about cheese, it's definitely worth taking his channel a look. I'll put the link to his videos in the description below. But yes, White Dwarf 158. This was, as you may have gathered from the cover, a High Elf centered issue, and there was also a load of stuff to do with Space Wolves in here. I would actually consider this to almost be a precursor to the Space Wolf Codex that came out with 2nd edition 40k. But enough waffle from me, let's dive in. So first of all, straight away you can see there's an advert inside for a new game called Tyranid Attack. This was a bit like a kind of a, not a spin-off from Space Hulk, but a similar game to Space Hulk insofar as it involved battling through the corridors of a spaceship, but in this case an alien hive ship. And it's important because this features quite heavily in this issue of White Dwarf. But moving forward beyond that then, what we have is the first of the Space Wolf related articles, Njal Stormcaller. And this was the Rogue Trader era of Space Wolves. So this was kind of an add-on, I suppose, to the existing rules for Space Marines that had been published in Rogue Trader. And like I said, it's very much a precursor to what we would see in the Space Wolf Codex in 2nd edition, and to be honest, what we've seen in Space Wolf Codexes ever since then. The rules for Njal are published straight here. It's very much more of a roleplay character style, as you'd expect from Rogue Trader, but it's got the background for him, all about how he became Ragnar Blackmane's personal rune priest after the death of his previous rune priest, Heimdall. Some of the stuff that's in here, you wouldn't be surprised to hear, features fairly similarly in the Space Wolf novels. They're both by William King, and if you haven't checked out the Ragnar Blackmane novels, they're well worth a read. They're a little bit, I don't know, the first few at least are a little bit almost like Hogwarts but Space Wolves. Ragnar goes away to a Space Wolf school to learn all about being a Space Wolf. But beyond that, it's got some gorgeous artwork from Mark Gibbons, and then the colour section is almost certainly, it seems like it's been lifted straight out of the Space Wolf Codex from 2nd edition. It's got some glorious examples of pack markings, some different Great Company markings to the stuff that we perhaps see in the later Great Companies that appeared pretty much from 3rd ed onwards. But it's got all the models that I loved from that era of Space Wolves, brightly coloured red period colour schemes. I just love it. Similarly linked to this then, they also then do the rules for the Space Wolf characters in Space Marine, which was kind of the epic 40,000 precursor that was linked to Adeptus Titanicus, and he gives you both, again, the background and the rules for 3 of the great sort of mighty heroes of the Space Wolves as they were at the time, Ragnar Blackmane, Njal Stormcaller, and Ulrich the Slayer. These are, they're not unique models, they're just the existing Space Marine Command models that were available from Epic, but painted up in the style of the kind of different characters, and with little conversion bits. So, I mean, things like back banners added on the back, a wolf skull added onto the front of the Ulrich the Slayer one, and perhaps most coolly, they also then reproduce the banners in tiny scale, so you can cut them out or colour copy them or whatever, and then use them and stick them onto little pins onto the back of your own rhinos to make your own versions of them, which I think is really cool. They've also, quite cool, reproduced the psychic powers for Njal Stormcaller as well as a wind blast template. So really giving you everything you need to use these characters straight away in your game of Space Marine. They also then throw in the tactical cards for all of them, and there's, not surprisingly, an advert for the Space Marine game. Moving beyond that then, we get to this Tyranid Attack game. Now, I've never played this, and reading through this article, which is basically just kind of a brief guide to how the game was played, I really wish I had. Apparently, it was reproduced as Advanced Space Crusade, for anybody who'd played that. I played original Space Crusade that was advertised on TV. I remember seeing the adverts for that. If I can, I will try and throw one of those up here.
Space Crusade takes you into warp space to fight the force of chaos. Deep in a parallel universe where nightmares are real. Space Crusade, the ultimate adventure game where you must use all your skill and weaponry.
Plasma gun, dreadnought!
To battle through infested starships, emerge the victor, and win the highest rank. The ultimate encounter is here. Space Crusade.
But aside from that, this is it's a rolling road game. So the idea is you've got board tiles that represent the different sections of a Tyranid Hive ship. You've got a whole bunch of Space Marines, Scouts, Terminators, even a Librarian that are all tasked with infiltrating this Hive ship, getting to vital key locations and destroying essentially key organs within the Hive ship's body. And the way this works is you have an initial setup of the board tiles, and then as you get to the front of the first set of board tiles, then you produce a new card, you take one off the back, add a new tile onto the front, and then you just essentially have this rolling road of, as you push further and deeper in, your forces get depleted, whilst the Tyranids get an ever-renewing supply of Gene Stealers, Tyranid Warriors, and interestingly, Gene Cult hybrids with, auto pistols and stuff. This is a bit of a departure from the background of Gene Cult as we see it now, where very much as soon as the Hive fleet turns up in orbit around a Gene Cult planet, all the cultists, they're just going in the soup. So they're into the digestion pools and then slurped up by the Hive ship's kind of proboscis or whatever, and digested on board the ship and reproduced as fresh genetic material to make whole new waves of Tyranid monsters. This seems to imply, though, that living cultists would have been quite regularly seen aboard a Hive ship. And again, I suppose this is a bit of a departure from the background as we see it now, but I think it's quite a cool idea. The idea that the coming of your kind of deity, god, star beasts isn't the end of your life, it's just the beginning of a new chapter where you get to roam the stars aboard the glory, inside the body, I suppose, of your glorious many-armed emperor. But yeah, it's a cool looking game. I've never played it. I've had a look online, but I haven't been able to lay my hands on a copy. If anyone knows of one going anywhere, please post a link in the comments below, and I'll try and get to it before somebody else swipes it up. Moving forward then, we get to probably the two meaty parts of this issue, and the reason why we've got elves slapped all over the cover. Eltharion the Grim. He's a huge character in the old world fantasy background. He plays a key role right from kind of this point on in 4th edition all the way through 6th, 7th, and right up to the end times. And I think he's probably one of my favourite elf characters, and so far he's almost Tolkien-esque in his style. It's not surprising, I suppose, given that the background of the old world was very heavily influenced by kind of Lord of the Rings. But he's this kind of tragic figure of this grim, foreboding elf lord who's gifted in all kinds of fields but has been cursed with a tragic past, which is set out in this article, in this story by Bill King here. I'm not going to read the whole thing through you, I'm just going to go through kind of the core plot points that made up the saga of Eltharion the Grim. And the reason that this was produced was it was to coincide with the release of the High Elf army book that was being released for 4th edition at the time, and the Eltharion model together, which it's kind of doubled as a High Elf Lord on Griffin, if you just wanted a generic High Elf Lord on Griffin. One of the reasons why I love this background is it features one of my favourite characters from the Orc and Goblin book, and that is Grom the Paunch. You can see him, he's on my very faded t-shirt here. I'll throw a better picture up on the thing so you can see him properly. Grom the Paunch is my favourite little kind of gobbo character because he's just so silly. He is essentially a fat goblin. That's his UNSP is, oh, I'm a goblin, but I'm really big and fat. Because he's eaten a chunk of troll flesh, and that's kind of continuously regenerating in his stomach as he's trying to digest it. So as a result, his body's absorbing nutrients all the time because it's constantly full of food. But that doesn't stop him from still stuffing his maw with all the kind of the stuff that he can get his little gnashers on. And as a result, he's this huge kind of fat goblin with a big axe who rides a wolf chariot pulled by 3 wolves. Why 3 wolves? Why not? I mean, it's kind of like the Reliant Robin of the Warhammer world. But yeah, so it's a story where you've got this grim, brooding saga of an elf lord who has terrible things befall him at the hands of this capering, ridiculous little green sort of munchkin, which is, again, I suppose it's very much in keeping with the Warhammer theme that for every great story, there's also something completely ridiculous. But so the story of Eltharion the Grim is that he was the eldest son of the Lord Moranion, who had been dispatched off to fight against the Dark Elves with much of his realm, his father's part of the realm's army. And in the meantime, Grom had been granted this vision from the Orc gods, perhaps Gork or Mork or even the Chaos gods had sent him, urging him to gather this mighty little war and sail across the sea, rather than use it to carve out his own kingdom in the old world. He sails across the Sea of Claws to go and battle against the High Elves in Ulthuan itself. And I mean, over half of his fleet is drowned or is eaten by krakens or just gets lost on the way to Ulthuan, but he still ends up with a sizable horde when he lands. And because his eldest son is away still fighting against the Dark Elves, the Elven Lord Moranion actually goes forth and fights against Grom himself, and unfortunately is brought low, and it describes how Grom steering his chariot directly towards the old elf, who stood in silver mail with a cloak of white wolfskin, his hand on a rune-inlaid blade known as Fang Sword. Grom dismounts, hefting his massive double-handed axe, and does battle against the Elf Lord, blocking every sweep of the elf's sword with the axe before dropping the old warrior with a single blow from a mailed fist, and then throwing the unconscious form of this elven noble over his shoulder. He just kind of bellows encouragement to the rest of his lads and hops back on his chariot and makes off. And the next thing Moranion knows, he wakes up inside his own castle, but Grom's sat on the throne wearing his wolfskin cloak that he's ripped from Moranion's shoulders, while Moranion's being kind of poked and prodded by this capering goblin jester. And so Moranion then is sort of interrogated by Grom, and Grom learns that the castle that he's conquered isn't even the grandest in the area, that the capital of the realm, Torivés, is nearby. And so again he musters his army after they've drunk themselves stupid on fine wines of ancient vintage and essentially trashed the place just because they're goblins. Straps the naked form of Moranion to the front of his chariot and goes herring off to go and lay waste to the rest of this particular part of Ulthuan. Meanwhile, up in the Northlands, Eltharion has been stabbed by a poisoned witch elf dagger and is near death, essentially, coping with the poison that's in his body, when this Hamlet-style ghost of his father appears to him and warns him of what's happening back in the homelands, and says that, above all, he must seek revenge upon the one who wears the white wolfskin cloak. That is an important point, bear with that. But so Eltharion gathers up the army of Torivés and sort of tells it to set sail back to the homeland. Meanwhile, he mounts up on his griffin, Stormwing, and flies off ahead to try and get back there as fast as he can. Grom, meanwhile, together with Blackfang, his sort of drinking buddy turned shaman, is still rampaging across the lands of Torivés, and in particular Blackfang has started to get his own visions in relation to these huge rune stones that are scattered around Ulthuan. These are the stones that were left behind by the old ones that essentially are there to keep Ulthuan from sinking below the sea. Again, overtones of Tolkien there, but also to hold back the realm of chaos from bursting out any further than it already has at the northern pole up in the Chaos Wastes. And so he starts drawing magic out of these runestones to power his more powerful spells, in the process weakening the bonds that are holding the Chaos Gate in place and endangering the whole of Ulthuan. Grom, of course, doesn't care. He's just carving out his merry little kingdom, and as far as he's concerned, it's all a great big laugh. But so he eventually reaches the gates of Torivés. Eltharion's got a younger brother by the name of Argellan, who has been, much as his brother's a skilled warrior, he's been learning the arts of sorcery from the master mages of Safari in the tallest sort of tower in the centre of Torivés. He and the commander of the Citadel Guard, an elf by the name of Fergal the Iron Spear, set out to try and hold Grom off. But when Argellan sees his father's kind of battered body strapped to the front of Grom's chariot, he just completely loses the plot, forgets about all the skills of magic he's learned, and throws himself at Grom. And again, this is exactly what Grom's after. He batters Argellan to the ground, hacks him to pieces with his axe, hefts the body of the prince over his shoulder, cheering out with glee, and it completely breaks the spirit of the elven army, which then retreats and is run down to a greater or lesser degree by the hordes of Grom. But so Grom and Blackfang, who's riding on a huge wyvern at this point, invade the capital of Torivés itself, where the central runestone for this whole part of Ulthuan is located. And Blackfang kind of takes up residence at the top of the Tower of Sorcery, drawing off the magic from this runestone, even beginning to worry Grom a bit at this point, to the point where Grom decides that maybe it would be a good idea if somebody else wore this pretty white wolf cloak that he took from the Elven Lord. So hands it off to his drinking buddy, because, he doesn't want him to catch cold. And then when Eltharion arrives, of course, he goes looking for the person his father's told him to kill, this guy in the white wolf skin cloak. So he sends the bulk of his forces charging towards the Tower of Sorcery, at the base of the tower, while he flies up on Stormwing to do battle in the tower itself. He fights against Grom, he fights against Blackfang, and Blackfang starts hammering him with the most potent magic he can kind of draw off from the power of the runestone. But it's at that point that his warriors, Eltharion's warriors, carry out something known as the Invocation of Ending, and cut off the flow of magic going into the runestone, which is a huge risk, because at that point there's entirely the risk that Ulthuan would just sink into the sea, and the realms of chaos would flood the old world. But as it does, it pays off. It stops Black Fang from casting his most potent spells, and Eltharion is able then to strike him down. Grom, meanwhile, it's suggested, does a kind of exit stage right manoeuvre, and it describes that no one really knows what happened to Grom after that. Some say that he died of wounds inflicted in his battle with Eltharion. Others suggest that he went off to the nearby mountain range that's heavily saturated with dark magic to carve out a kingdom in the caves and caverns there, while still others suggest he mounted up on Blackfang's wyvern, Doom Serpent, and flew back to the old world. This really just setting up the option that you can use Grom in your games after that he's not just decapitated by Eltharion and that's the end of the story. Nor is it the end of Eltharion's story. Eltharion, of course, was to have all kinds of stuff happen to him during 6th edition and during the end times, and I'll cover that in a future video. But what's cool is they've given us all the rules for Eltharion here, so although the High Elf Army book was coming out, they printed all the rules to use Eltharion, they used his points value, and they even gave us the magic item cards for the 2 sort of unique magic items that he packed. So that's the Fang Sword of Eltharion, not imaginatively named, and the Talisman of Hoeth, essentially the sword he's taken from his dead father, and the Talisman of Sorcery he's taken from his dead brother. Totally leaning into this whole tragic backstory saga type approach. But what it basically means is he's a really skilled elven warrior, elven lord, mounted on a really powerful griffin, who also, thanks to the Talisman of Sorcery, is a level 2 sorcerer. So he really is kind of the triple threat when it comes to elven characters. And I don't own a model of Eltharion, but having read through this issue of White Dwarf again and the background for him, I am sorely tempted to try and get myself one of these models, perhaps to lead one of my High Elf armies in the future. Moving beyond that then, the next thing we get is more wolfy goodness. You've got to love the Space Wolves. Ridiculous werewolf Vikings in space. They really are just an example of why we shouldn't take the background of 40k too seriously. This was to coincide with the release of the Wolfguard and Terminator models. What they did was, rather than just do a, hey look, this is what Wolfguard and Terminator look like, article, they did a Space Hulk article, and they gave us some essentially 3 missions, unique missions that you can play out as part of a linked Space Hulk campaign using the tiles you've got from your Resisting Space Hulk set, but also including just some rules for the different models that the Wolfguard Terminator Arm models came with, which I think is a really cool way of introducing them. And I think it'd also be quite cool to see whether or not the tiles that the most recent version of Space Hulk came out with would work for this layout. I might have to try that in a future video. Skipping past that then, we have a beautiful article by Mike McVeigh. This was an heavy metal article, and I guess this was in the days before we had YouTube channels. There were some excellent YouTube channels out there now. I subscribe to Sonic Screwdriver for his cool painting tutorials, and also I worship at the altar of Duncan Too Thin Coats for his awesome painting videos. But back then, of course, we didn't have that opportunity, so we were kind of dependent on the stuff that you got in White Dwarf for how to paint the awesome models up to an heavy metal standard. And that's just really what they've done in this article here. The Heavy Metal team have given us a painting guide for some of the new releases from this month. So it gives us a painting guide for Eltharion on Stormwing, also for the High Elf Tyranid Chariot that came out then, and also for some Savage Orc models that came out. I don't obviously own the paints that they show here, because a lot of these paints, although they've got modern equivalents, they don't exist as we know them today. But it would be quite cool maybe to, if I got my hands on like a Savage Orc model or Eltharion, to see if I could use the similar paints from the current range to follow this painting tutorial and see how they come out. I might do that in a future video. But so moving on again, we get to by far the coolest part of this. I know I've ranted on about how cool Eltharion's article is, but this is my favourite. This is a Rogue Trader era 40k battle report, and this is notable for 2 reasons. This was the first battle report between Andy Chambers and Jarvis Johnson, who would go on to have a many and storied past over the course of various White Dwarf battle reports, but this is also the first time we see a battle report either for Ragnar Blackmane or for Ghazghkull Thraka. And not only that, it's a battle report of Ragnar Blackmane versus Ghazghkull Thraka. I thought it was quite cool when they brought Saga of the Beast out. I wasn't aware that the two of them had such a storied past. Everyone thinks of Ghazghkull, they think of Commissar Yarrick, Emperor rest his soul. But no, here, this is the first showdown, really the first rivalry we see between Ghazghkull and anybody in the Imperial forces is Ragnar then. And this was cool insofar as they, rather than just do a, look, you put all your toys on the table, I'll put all my toys on the table, and we'll fight it out in the middle, that approach. They wrote a particular scenario for this battle report, all centred around a wrecked Dark Angel's Predator that contained some vital intelligence that the Orcs were trying to capture, and the Space Wolves were trying to recover. And yeah, the Orc army, here we go. So Orcs, it was 2,000 points, Ghazghkull, Makari, and a bunch of Orc nobs inside a battle wagon, backed up by a whole bunch of Goth boys, some Bad Moon boys, a super heavy dreadnought, which I think that was made using some of the vehicle design rules, and then a decent scattering of speed freaks and some shock attack gun stuff. 2,000 points for this one. Space Wolves, meanwhile, were running with essentially every Space Wolf model the Heavy Metal team had painted. So this is all three of the special characters. It's Ragnar, Ulrich, and Jarl Stormcaller. All the Grey Hunters they had painted, all the Blood Claws they had painted, the Long Fangs they had painted, and the Wolfguard Terminators. Again, conveniently, all those models clock in at 2,000 points in Rogue Trader. I've run this stuff through Battlescribe just to see how this would work out in new money, and the Orcs isn't actually far off. The Orcs is about 1,800 points under the current points values. The Space Wolves have gone down in points quite a bit. This is barely 1,000 points if we were to run it as Space Wolf Army today. Nonetheless, I think it would be quite cool to refight this battle report at some point using comparable forces and just see how well the two armies do. It's got all the things that we come to love from battle report. It's got maps, it's got in-game photos, and it's got some awesome artwork from Wayne England as well. But I just love the way in which it almost comes down to an Orky approach as well, whereas the Space Marines become hyper-focused on achieving the mission, with Ragnar driving into the Orc army towards the fallen Predator. Ghazghkull and the Orcs just get confused and a little bit, get caught up in the moment and get hyper-focused on just crumping as many beakies as he can get their mitts on. And even Jarvis admits in the wrap-up at the end that that's part of the reason why he, spoiler alert, loses this one, because he just gets so focused on kind of throwing Ghazghkull down the wing towards a big concentration of beakies that he forgets about the fact that he would have been far better off throwing him into the middle of the kind of the board towards where the Predator is, where the most powerful of the Space Marine characters was going. But yeah, so a fairly important battle report and also a lot of fun to read. I hadn't really played any games of Rogue Trader. The first games of 40k I played was 2nd edition. So reading through how Rogue Trader games were played, it was again quite interesting to see all the different, very much kind of roleplay style sort of quirks and tricks that feature in that. Final bits, we've got, as ever, the mail order section with all various models that you could get, including the Space Marine special characters, the Ghazghkull miniature, and all the High Elf stuff. And then we finish off with just an advert for the High Elf book that was coming out, and on the back cover a lovely bit of in-game photography, a little bit like some of the stuff that Garfi does. A nicely laid up scene with you've got a painted backdrop and then two beautiful armies laid out, in this case Blood Angels versus Eldar. But so there we go, that is a whistle-stop tour through issue 158 of White Dwarf. I hope you enjoyed it, and can I just remind everyone to check out my Tale of Four Gamers video. I am desperately painting Bretonians this month, and I will still be throwing up pictures of how those are progressing and how the rest of the Four Gamers armies are progressing up on Twitter. In the meantime, if there's anything in the last series of videos that I've done that you've really enjoyed, or if there's anything you'd like to see me to do more of or less of, just let me know in the comments below, and I'll see what I can do to keep these videos interesting for people. In the meantime, though, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.